That was a little bit longer maybe. I wanted to make a point about the Spirit of the Lord upon us all from Isaiah 61, that we all have work to do. And I think that's good news and graceful news, that we always don't think about or remember how the Spirit is a part of our lives, how the Spirit guides us and blesses us, how the Spirit invites us into the world, into relationships with others. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. For no other good reason than that. And the same thing with you all. In the waters of baptism, the Spirit of the Lord is upon you because the Lord has anointed you. And will use your gifts, whatever they may be, whether you're a builder like Iggy Peck, or someone who shares greetings and cards, or someone who has wisdom, or someone who will volunteer to serve on a committee or a church group, or help teach Sunday school, or in various ways out in the community. The Spirit of the Lord, I pray, continues to guide you and keep you and bless you and lead you into building opportunities and hopes and dreams and working for God in this world. With that in mind, we have a congregation council that will be installed in a few minutes. We installed some of them at the early worship service. Last fall, the council put together a video. Martin Luther comes to council in celebration of 500 years of the Reformation, and there was a silly video about what would happen if Martin Luther came to council, and we had a lot of fun and we had a lot of laughter with this video and with this opportunity. In December, we had a conversation at council, and I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 30 minutes. It could have lasted for hours. But the conversation was about the most recent shootings in Texas at a church, and what St. Mark's might need to do with regards to safety or security. And we even contacted Mooresville Police Department, and Dave Harding, crime prevention officer, came by and visited with me. He was here about an hour and a half. We walked around the building. He asked about all our procedures and how we do things. And then he sent an email 2 days later with 2 pages worth of, here's some ideas that may help your congregation be more safe. And then Mooresville Police Department will be doing some training as well coming up. Don Fletcher in the past has attended one of these, and they'll be doing another one of these soon, and maybe we'll have some others. Dave Harding also said that he would be glad to come to St. Mark's to help guide conversations sometime with ushers or whoever might be interested. But with that in mind, and baptism this day, I just saw this article 2 days ago. It was written, well, it's published on January 3rd, and it's written by a Baptist pastor out of Texas. And I wanted to share it with you because what this Baptist pastor writes is a bit about what St. Mark's Council, at least, has wrestled with. Kyle Childress is his name. And Pastor Childress writes, there's an old story from church history about a Roman emperor who ordered his soldiers to be baptized in mass. In mass, meaning as a large group. Down into the waters they went, except for their right hands. They kept their right hands, which held their swords, out of the water, so their whole body was baptized except for their fighting arm and sword. Why? It's because if this arm causes us to sin or to do something, then at least the rest of us is saved, right? The story came up again in a conversation I had in a restaurant. We got to talking about church security in the aftermath of the shooting at Sutherland Springs Baptist Church in South Texas, and about how different churches in town were responding. Some churches were arming their ushers, but most of the ones he knew were content in knowing that many people in this Texas congregation were armed on Sunday mornings. I brought up the baptism story about how we might be keeping our arms up out of the water. He responded with an interpretation I've never heard before. Maybe that means we can carry guns and be faithful Christians at the same time. I knew he was a Baptist who was serious about his faith and who believed in full immersion baptism. Something from my Southern Baptist past bubbled up in my memory, and I said, you know the old saying, Jesus is Lord of all, or he's not Lord at all? Jesus is Lord of all, or he's not Lord at all. He responded, I know. But what are we going to do? We have to protect ourselves. In other words, Jesus is Lord of our whole body, hand, arms, and as well. But what are we going to do if we, can we keep this arm out, or is it part of our bodies? And what does it mean for the lordship in our lives? So Childress continues. The question churches all over the country have been asking after the Sutherland Springs shooting is this: what are we going to do? His congregation gathered for a conversation about this. They chose to speak about safety rather than security as a way to try to tone down the conversation swirling about us, which is inundated with images of guns and guards in black uniforms. All that seems to be missing from those visions of security are sandbag emplacements at the front door and helicopters sweeping the perimeter of the church property. Congregations are being offered security training for ushers and others. Some security firms offer free handgun training for the pastors so that the clergy can arm themselves while they're even in the pulpit. There seems to be little understanding that carrying guns in church is at the very least an exception to the Christian practice. Now it seems to be considered conforming to Christian teaching. Hands held up from the waters of baptism, holding a gun, are more and more considered orthodox. When our congregation gathered, I gave a few introductory comments, says Childress, but for the most part, I simply moderated the discussion. People needed to talk. They needed to express their fears. Some were worried that our longtime countercultural witness was putting us too much in the spotlight and perhaps bringing us to the attention of some crazy person. Several people talked about how having children and grandchildren in the church changed their comfort level. While they were willing to do something for themselves or put themselves at risk, they were not willing to do so for the children or grandchildren. Even so, they were emphatic that being the church, the body of Christ, did not include guns. I'll say that following our council conversation with some announcements and some other things that went out, there were some folks at St. Mark's who had mixed opinions, had these very same concerns and tensions that they lived into. What about our Christian practice? What about our Christian faith? What about guns and protecting ourselves? Childress continues. Eventually, the conversation moved to practical matters, just like it did at St. Mark's. How many doors do we have open on Sunday mornings, and what should we do about them? How many ushers do we have, and should we increase the number? Where and how do we greet people on Sunday mornings? The biggest worry was about our nursery. We discussed how we might make it safer, whether by changing the doors or adding locks or adding more adult volunteers. Fortunately, we had a couple of church members who were familiar with studies on church safety, and they were able to share their perspectives with the rest of us. Lots of humor surfaced as well, as it often does in tense times. The ushers loved the idea of getting a clip-on walkie-talkie and earpieces so they could whisper into their lapels, "The pastor is now in the pulpit." The conversation, though, went off the rails when they started coming up with code names for the pastor. The big guy, the shepherd, the robe, and others less complimentary. Someone mentioned that last year in Texas, they rescinded an 1876 law forbidding the wearing of swords and Bowie knives in public, so we could now outfit the ushers with swords. And there was a discussion of what kind of sword each usher might wear. Even the pastor wondered aloud what type of sword would look good with his robe, and maybe he could be called Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings. And someone else said, "No, Friar Tuck is a better statement for you." The most interesting and gratifying part of the conversation was how foundational theological convictions kept coming up. Over and over again, someone mentioned the practice of Christian hospitality. Because of Jesus, we said we were committed to welcoming the stranger, even though it might be a risky thing to do. We were committed to being a more safe environment, but within our theological framework. In fact, some church members talked about enhanced hospitality and extreme welcoming. Let's have people out on the front steps, giving people a holy hug when they come up the steps, they said, and a pat down at the same time. They were asking how we might build upon our convictions and live into the gifts God has given us rather than compromising them. St. Mark's Council was wrestling with the same thing for a bit, and still is. A longtime member at Childress Church stood up and reminded the congregation that at the heart of the issue was baptism. This church member said, "When we were lowered into the waters, when we were baptized, the pastor said that you were buried with Christ in baptism." I said the same thing this past week at Hazel Basinger's funeral service. We say that we were buried with Christ in baptism so that we'll be raised with Christ in the resurrection. In other words, our lives are not our own, continued this older church member at that place in Texas. Our lives are not our own. This is no guarantee of a risk-free life. It's a guarantee that we are not alone when we walk the way of resurrection. And then this man's wife stood up and spoke. And she said, we know that. We know there's no guarantee, but what about our children and grandchildren? How do we protect them? Pastor Childress says, we did not resolve the questions that night, and I don't know that we ever will. But they have given us plenty to think about and to pray about, plenty to live into. They have given me plenty to preach about too, says Pastor Childress. And I know that the next time I baptize someone in the waters and say that they are buried with Christ, the whole congregation will be thinking about those words in ways we never used to. May you consider all the various celebrations of baptism this day, of Jesus' baptism as well as what it means for us, of how the Spirit of the Lord has anointed you, as well as the tensions that we live into of what it might mean to be a baptized Christian in our world, that maybe our lives aren't ours anymore. Amen.